important question to me was, does science really know, as it claims to know, of purely material natural processes which are capable of making the kinds of changes and innovations that are needed? It has to, in pre-biological evolution, produce the first living organism out of non-living chemicals, and then it's got to take that replicating molecule or bacterial cell or whatever you want to imagine it to be, all the way up into the many diverse and complex life forms that there are today. It has to be able to evolve, well, let us say, the eye, a very complex mechanism which requires complex neural mechanisms behind it in order to be of any use. So you have to be able to make decisions based on what you see. And it has to have been able to produce the eye over 40 different times by this purely naturalistic process of evolution, because there are that many distinct types of eyes, according to leading evolutionary biologists in the animal kingdom. And that's just one example. There are many different types of wings, many different types of, you name it, that are all these extremely complex innovations. And the question is, do they really know of a process that's capable of doing all this, or is it a claim resting on inadequate evidence? And that's what I wanted to test. And that's really the subject of my book, Darwin on Trial. Now, naturally, in this lecture, I can't go over all the evidence that's in the book. I can only give you a flavor of the kind of thinking, the kind of approach that's in the book. I have 2 chapters, 2 and 3, on natural selection and mutation, in which I explore the fact, really, that the natural selection process has been shown to produce only very limited variations within a population, and cyclical variations, in fact, rather than fundamental directional changes of the kind that change one thing into another. The most famous demonstration of the power of natural selection that's been used as proof of the whole theory in textbooks for many years is the peppered moth observations, which all of you have taken any biology at all have heard about, I'm sure, that, to put it very briefly, an area of England contained a population of peppered moths, some of which were dark and some of which were light-colored. And when the trees became darkened due to industrial smoke, the dark moths predominated. There were more dark moths than light moths. And then when the air was cleaned up, and so the trees got lighter again, you had a resurgence of the light moth population. Well, that certainly shows one can have variations in the numbers, but as anyone can see looking at it, it doesn't tell you much about how moths, trees, and scientific observers got there in the first place. And in fact, both light and dark-colored moths were present in the population all the way along. The selective breeding experiments, which are used to demonstrate, which we want to make Darwin's main arguments, and still are, by breeding you can get a lot of different kinds of dogs, as one sees, although they're all within one biological species. While in plants, one can make members of separate breeding communities, apparently, and in this case cross the most commonly used definition of species boundary, one still gets variation only strictly within limited boundaries. And the limits on the variation are not due to the fact that you run out of time. That's the important thing. It isn't that you run out of time, it's that because you run out of variation before you run out of time. And thus the reason we do not get dogs as big as elephants, much less dogs turn into elephants, is not that we don't have enough time, but that there isn't that much variability in the dog genome, because the dogs stop getting bigger long before they're reaching the elephant size. So the artificial selection evidence really shows the limitations rather than the power of the process. That's chapters 2 and 3. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 deal primarily with the fossil evidence. Here I ask the reader to consider what anyone would have predicted the fossil evidence to show if the theory were true. If you're familiar with the original, with Darwin's Origin of Species, you know that when he deals with this subject, he explains away negative evidence. He says, I admit the fossils are dead against me, but it's not fatal. The fossils do not show any transitions, gradual step-by-step transitions of one thing into another, but that's just because they're snapshots of the past. There are many gaps in the fossil record. It was all going on, but it just never got recorded. And 130 years later, after very diligent search to validate the theory, it is commonly stated in the paleontological literature now that the outstanding fact of the fossil record is, on the one hand, its sudden appearance. New kinds of creatures appear from time to time in different age rocks, but they appear suddenly. And then, more importantly, they persist fundamentally unchanged. This is stasis in the jargon of the trade, throughout their time on Earth. I deal with the molecular evidence in Chapter 7, which is a bit more complicated subject. I won't try to cover it tonight, but which, in my opinion, fairly analyzed, shows confirmation of the pattern of relationship, which we already saw to exist. Remember, relationship was the one thing other than complexity that needed to be explained, but does nothing at all to help with the question of whether natural selection has the kind of creative power that is required to make the system work. And then in Chapter 8, I deal with the chemical evidence of pre-biological evolution, the first origin of life. Now, one can build up quite a negative case by going through evidence like that, and other people have done that before me. And in a way, it's almost not really the point. Because someone who wants to defend the theory will just simply say, oh, well, every theory has its problems. Science has solved many problems before. We can solve these. And so merely by showing that we haven't solved a whole lot of problems, we haven't really defeated the theory. And at this point, I want to go into what I think is really the crucial question. That one has to know something about the evidence to evaluate, but it is really much more important than simply lining up the evidence on one side or the other or listing problems with the theory. It's really the way that the evolutionary biology community thinks about the theory. Now, I'll illustrate this by telling you the problem that I kept running into when I was trying to raise questions. I'm a professor at one of the world's great science universities. I'm in the School of Law. I'm not in one of the science faculties, but I have lots of friends and colleagues who are very distinguished scientists in this evolutionary biology and other subjects. And others who aren't really in that field but think they know a lot about it. And so I would, with any group, I'd come in and I'd say, well, look, I want to know, is this really true? Look at this problem. Look at that problem. And what I would find is, instead of getting the kind of answers that satisfied me, I'd get a response like this. Well, what's your alternative? And I'd say, well, let's say, how about God created? That's outside of science. Oh. Well, how about we don't know the answer? You don't know how science works. It turns out that the rules of the game, this is my Chapter 9, really, the rules of the game, the rules of science, I tell you that in the first place, you aren't allowed to consider anything outside of science, that the supernatural. This is another way, I guess, of saying something outside of nature, outside of the natural, and science can deal only with the natural and the material. Now, that's perfectly all right to say that science can deal only with the natural and the material. But on the other hand, science aims to answer the question of how we came to be here. And if it tells us the truth about how we came to be here, and if it tells us that we came to be here without anything out of nature or outside of matter being involved in it, it's dealt with something outside of science, hasn't it? It's dealt with the non-material and the non-natural, essentially by saying that it's been established that they did not have any effect. And that was one thing that bothered me. How can you deal with something by saying you're not going to deal with it, and then deal with it and answer the question while refusing to take it into account? But the second part of this was even more impressive, you see, because it turned out that one cannot argue, in accordance with the rules of the scientific game, that Darwinism is false. What one can do is improve it with a better theory. But since it's the scientific paradigm, it's in place, and it gives what is considered to be a reasonably plausible answer that's accepted by a lot of people. It stands as true until and unless it's improved. And of course, it can only be improved by something that meets the philosophical rules of the game, something natural, something material. And so you can see the rules build in the answer. If you can't consider the non-material and the non-natural, and if you've got to have an answer, and you can't throw out the answer without having something else that's material and natural to replace it, well then of course everything was created by the natural and the material. And indeed, I found it extremely difficult even to get anyone to focus on the question of, can natural selection really do all of this? Now, it's the accepted scientific answer. What's your alternative? You don't know how science works. Now, those kinds of replies, far from satisfying me, made me think that this is exactly how I see people argue when they're trying to avoid knowing something rather than trying to find out something. And clearly, anyone that can set rules of argument that are that powerful can control the outcome. And so that's what we have here. And I became aware that there were a great many people who did not know and did not care about the difference between what they assumed at the beginning of the argument and what they got out at the other end as conclusion. They would say, we have established that non-material and non-natural factors can do all of this, therefore there is no influence outside of the natural. And when you said, well, I want to see whether that's true, you say, okay, but you've got to play by the rules of the game where we assume that only natural and material factors can do anything, and that whatever your plausible answer is can do it. Now, that experience is what I recount in Darwin on Trial. And it leads me to the conclusion that we have to think at this point in our history about two great experiences that we've had in our times, in our century, and in my lifetime, and perhaps a bit longer, both relating to that wonderful thing, science. And I think we've discovered two things by experience through this century. First, science is a wonderful thing. It can discover a whole lot, and it can do a lot of things. I mean, we all see this. I mean, here there is this video camera, which is recording. There's this microphone here. There are these electric lights. There's the spaceship that goes up and goes to the moon, and there's those wonderful bombs that blow us up in our cities, and there are, which are impressive, dangerous as they may be, are certainly impressive technological accomplishments. So, of course, everybody thinks science has got to be credible. It's really got to be true, basically, or it couldn't do all those wonderful things. But then there's the second lesson, which is equally important. That in a culture which trusts something, you'll find that the untrustworthy tries to look like the thing that everybody trusts. See, if everybody believes in a particular kind of religion, you see, then if you're a con man, what you'll do is you'll pose as a bishop of that religion. And say, and if you can get people to accept you, you'll be able to illegitimately borrow the credibility that religion has. Well, if the religion of the community is science, that is to say, if the thing that they really believe in, because I mean, I've seen these rockets, is science, and you want to get them to believe something that isn't very well founded, what will you do? Well, it's obvious. You will tell them it's science. And if you can get yourself accepted as science, then by the people that make those rockets and so on, then you have a tremendous ability to win trust and credibility that may get people not to examine the bona fides of your argument as carefully as they otherwise might. Now, in our century, look at the examples we have seen of this that have been so powerful and so persuasive. Marxism, the science of society, scientific. Indeed, that was always the great appeal of Marxist socialism, of some other types of socialism as well. That this is science applied to society. And so if you accept the scientific method, the scientific outlook, you will accept Marxism. Now today we see this science in shambles. We see it collapsing all over the globe. And I think it's almost hard to imagine that in the 1920s and 30s, most intellectuals throughout the world accepted the scientific pretensions and claims of Marxism to be the science of society. Freudianism, Freudian psychoanalysis, the science of the mind, and a tremendous number of otherwise very skeptical intellectuals would say, well, we're willing to believe Dr. Freud when he tells us that all of these little boys wanted to murder their fathers and marry their mothers. And the psychoanalyst would say, yes, we know this is true. We have clinical evidence. We have these people that we have psychoanalyzed. And at first they denied that they had an Oedipus complex. But after we had them on the couch 5 hours a week for 5 years, telling them that they had one, at the end of it they acknowledged that they did. And so we have clinical evidence which establishes that this is the case. Now, so the question I would, now both Freudianism and Marxism have lost their scientific pretensions, and the people who need to believe in them is really the imaginative appeal. And the question that I really am putting at the end of my book is Darwinism that kind of science, as opposed to the kind of science, designing an airplane, the kind of science that's based on repeatable experiments that you can do over and over again and find out if it's really true. Well, of course, I conclude that it is. Darwin, Marx, and Freud were the great intellectual influences on the 20th century. And they were all science at the same time. You don't have to take my word for that. If you have an evolutionary biology course here at Penn, it's very possible that they use one of the 2 leading textbooks on the subject by Professor Douglas Batuma of State University of New York at Stony Brook, who said, it says in the opening chapter of his book, introducing the subject to students, Darwin did for biology what Freud did for the mind and Marx for society, which is to say, he outlined a total materialistic program and backed it up as scientific. And that was the proud boast. Poor Professor Batuma had not realized at the time he wrote that, I think, in 1986, that Marx and Freud had lost so much of their cachet. And what is common to all of these sciences is, again, I've developed at much greater length in the book, is the process of taking an idea as true because it has tremendous appeal to the imagination, because it tells you what you think ought to be true. It seems so appealing. And then viewing the evidence, as those psychoanalysts did with their patients, and selecting what you see there that fits your preconceived theory and then believing it's the truth. So I conclude that whatever evolutionary biologists may want to do or not want to do as a professional matter, there is no great reason for those of us outside that community to regard the claims that purely naturalistic processes have been demonstrated that can do all this work of creating as true. They are not established. If in fact there is such a purely materialistic and naturalistic process, it has yet to be discovered, and I suspect never will be discovered, although who can say that for sure. Therefore, we should put aside this notion, which is so widely proclaimed as fact throughout the university, that somehow naturalistic science has proved that you can do all the creating of the wonders of the biological world, including ourselves, without the need to have something involved that goes beyond that process. Well, that's where I'll leave my part of the presentation, and at this point I'd be very glad to take questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I'd like to raise a couple of questions. One is your definition of evolution. You say it's an unguided process.
It's a non-guided process.
Unguided.
Unguided, yeah.
Non-guided process. And he also says it's a gradual process. Is that correct? In recent literature, scientific literature over the last 10, 15 years, there's been quite a considerable controversy over this idea of a gradual evolutionary process. Many evolutionists, many people, biologists, are of the opinion that evolution occurs in spurts and occurs abruptly as opposed to a gradual process.
Do you want me to respond to that at this point? The question, for those of you, in case those of you didn't hear it, is that it says that literature indicates that there are many evolutionists who claim that they regard the process as occurring in spurts or abruptly rather than gradually. That's a restatement of what you just said. Actually, this is, I think, a somewhat misleading picture. Let me expand on it a bit to explain why. I indicated in my lecture that from the start, Darwin was pressed by T.H. Huxley and others to allow for some jumps. Now, the big reason why you had to allow for some jumps, in the opinion of the people that took this position, there are really two things. One was that it didn't seem that you could imagine advantageous intermediate forms in between some things and some other things. And an example that's easy to see is that if the theory is true, the whale is supposed to have evolved from a small four-footed land creature. And if you would try to imagine the intermediate steps of the legs becoming fins and the big tail and so on, you could see the thing in between sea and land and so on may have a lot of serious problems in surviving. So that was one problem, and that's repeated, just ad infinitum throughout the record. But the other problem is this problem that I indicated with the fossil record. Things appear fully formed suddenly. You do not see the gradual process of development of one thing from another. Now, because of this feature, from Darwin's time to the present, there have been particularly paleontologists, fossil people, who have proposed systems of evolution to make them consistent with the fossil record. And the example that you probably have in mind, the most famous recent example, is the punctuated equilibrium theory of Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. Now, when Gould and Eldredge proposed this idea that things stay pretty much the same for long periods of time and then evolution occurs suddenly and in spurts, and in small isolated populations, just a few creatures, you see. So that's why it never got fossilized, you see. The evolving all occurred off stage, as it were, in these small numbers of creatures and very rapidly. It sounded to many people as if they were proposing an evolution by jumps. But if they did that, they would be on the horns of the other dilemma. And they make this clear, by the way, in their own writings on this, that they had to avoid, in the end, they had to avoid this problem, which is the one, again, I already indicated that Darwin saw so clearly from the beginning. It won't do to say that you changed one thing into another kind of thing by a one-generation leap, because you don't have a mechanism that can do that and produce all the integrated changes, you see. Now you're talking about something that doesn't have a natural mechanism to account for it. It seems to be evoking a miracle, a virtual miracle. So that when Gould was faced with that, and Eldredge, what it turned out that they meant was that, well, geological time, a short time, a burst could mean 100,000 years or several 100,000 years. That's the amount of time in which that isolated population was evolving into something totally different. And in fact, it was evolving by Darwin's mechanism of descent with modification, step by step, one generation at a time, gradually. Only it happened in such a brief period of time, such as 100,000 years, that no fossils remain. So you see, in the end, they had to go back, and Gould has now emphasized again and again. He says, I don't know how we ever got misunderstood in this. Punctuated equilibrium was Darwinist all along. So you see, it was gradual, in the sense that while the change was occurring, it was step-by-step gradual. It's just that the periods of no change were much longer.
That's a concept many people have difficulty coming to grasp with, is geological time. How species...
Well, I'm just showing you, I do come to it, I guess.
Yes. I've heard many people espouse the creationist viewpoint, and it is find difficult to come to grasp that concept. Geological time covers a vast period of time. So a short, abrupt period is 100 million years.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah. But of course, one cannot cover all the difficulties by saying there was a lot of time available. You've still got a mechanism, and however much time you've got, that has to be adequate to do it, and that's the question. And there are two ways. I mean, one has to have, in my view, for a truly scientific theory, experimental evidence, which indicates the probability that the thing can do it. And then the other kind of evidence is historical evidence, the fossil evidence, that is to say, which indicates that it probably happened that way, or at least could have happened that way. And both kinds of evidence have to be viewed without a bias in favor of the theory that you're testing. Yeah?
Yes, sir. You was looking about non-material entities or whatever is in the scientific community not accepting that. And I understand the danger in that. But as a scientist, when matter myself. I'm wondering how would you, if you were to tell me something non-material exists, the first thing I would say was prove it, show it. How would you tell me that? Do you give me that historical and experimental evidence that you talked about?
Yes. Well, now, it isn't, to my mind, a question of proving that something non-material exists. I mean, what we start with is that we know that we exist. Now, the question is, do we know how we exist or what created us? So now, we can put the burden of proof anywhere you want. So you can, if somebody wants to say, well, we were created by something non-material, you can say, well, prove that that non-material exists. You can't do it, so as far as proof goes, you go. But then somebody said, well, therefore, we were created by this naturalistic, material process. Oh, wait a minute, not so fast. You prove that that can do that. And so it may well be a stalemate, and that nobody can really prove anything. At least by the kinds of evidence which are done through scientific investigation. Now, there's one distinction. I think it's of crucial importance to this, and if some people have trouble understanding geological time, as they do, as the gentleman rightly pointed out, I think this is a distinction that a lot of scientists have a lot of trouble getting, in my opinion. And that is the distinction between a methodological limitation and a dogma. Let me explain to you what I mean. Many people will say, and I think quite legitimately so, that science is limited to the material and the natural. It can't study the immaterial, the non-natural, and so on. Well, that's fine. But then, of course, what that means is that it can't make conclusions about that one way or the other. Now, the problem with that is that one wants to make conclusions about it. You say, one wants to say that the non-material didn't have anything to do with the process of creation because the material and the natural did it all. So what one tends to do that is one makes a very powerful assumption that nothing but the material and the natural can ever have an effect in the natural world. This is naturalistic philosophy. Now, to say that nothing but the material and natural can have any effect in the world is to say something very powerful about the non-natural and non-material. It's to say either that it doesn't exist or that it's, it never does anything, so it might as well not exist. Another way of putting this same point, I think, if you have any trouble seeing that, there's just another way around of putting the same kind of consideration. Let's say, you know how that game is? You have start with the answer and you ask, what is the question? Jeffrey, is that?
Yeah.
The answer is 9W, what is the question? Remember, you begin your name with a V, Mr. Wagner. If we play that game here, we'll say the answer is neo-Darwinism is correct, is true. Now, Darwinistic evolution is true. Now, what's the question? Is the question, how did we get here? How did we come to be formed? Or is the question, assuming that God had nothing to do with it, that nothing supernatural had anything to do with it, nothing non-material and non-natural had anything to do with it, then what is the best speculative guess that the science of our age has managed to make about how the thing might have been done? You see, then that's the question. Now, if that's the question, of course, then to a lot of people, while it may be the true answer, it's the true answer to a not very impressive question. Because the question assumes out all of the things that they really most want to know. And so the thing can be the best speculative guess that anybody's made in our time, our time going back to 1859, but it may be quite false. So that's another way of putting the question. And indeed, if one took seriously the notion that science isn't going to deal with the non-material, the supernatural at all, then the domain of science would really be limited. Because I have to say, we can't really say anything and say that it's true. We can just say that, making all these assumptions, it might be. That's not what we want to do. You wouldn't get as much, it wouldn't be as attractive when you present it to Congress in funding proposals, for example. If you didn't say what we're really doing is uncovering what's real and what's true. So I'll get to all of this. Let me get this.
Yeah, in this seemingly superhuman being stance, I think that something that's important to note is that us as humans, our survival, I think, can be enhanced by believing in this, in some form of transcendence of material. And I think that we as humans can either, number one, address this question and come up with a positive response to believe